Behind the Red Line, Episode 26. Cyntoia Brown, the girl they turned into a monster before they called her a child. There are stories that begin in darkness and never leave it, stories where the villain wears a friendly smile, stories where the victim looks like a suspect, stories where a child is pushed into the night, and the world pretends not to see. In 2004, Nashville police walked into a dim motel room and found a man lying dead in his bed, a gunshot wound to the back of his head, cash everywhere, guns hidden under the mattress, porn on the TV, and sitting in a stolen car miles away was a 16-year-old girl with haunted eyes and shaking hands. Her name was Cyntoia Brown. For years, they called her a murderer, a monster, a manipulative teenage killer who executed a stranger in cold blood. But that's not the real story. The real story begins long before that motel room, long before that gunshot, long before the world turned her into a headline. This is the story of a child, a girl who had already endured things most adults can't imagine, fighting to survive a world built to destroy her. This is Behind the Red Line. Episode 26, The Cyntoia Brown Case. The girl they broke before she fought back. Cyntoia was born into trauma. Her biological mother drank heavily during pregnancy, a detail no one cared about until it became a weapon against her in court. Cyntoia began life with neurological impacts that made impulse control harder, fear responses sharper, and danger feel like a storm she could never escape. She was adopted young, but chaos followed her like a shadow. By age 12, she was running from home, sleeping in strangers' houses, getting pulled into the orbit of older men who smiled, offered food, offered rides, then asked for things she was too young to understand. And then she met the man who would destroy what was left of her childhood, a man known as Kut-Throat. He was not a boyfriend. He was not a protector. He was not a partner. He was a trafficker. Kut-Throat was the kind of man girls disappear around. He was older, violent, manipulative, skilled at finding the broken pieces in vulnerable children and turning them into obedience. He beat Cyntoia, starved her, threatened her, told her she owed him, told her she'd die if she left. He isolated her from anyone who might help, taught her how to talk to men, forced her into survival sex work, night after night. To him, she wasn't a teenager. She wasn't even human. She was property. Cyntoia later said she lived in constant fight or flight mode, always scanning rooms for danger, always expecting violence, never feeling like she'd survive the next day. Her brain wasn't forming teenage memories. It was forming survival strategies. And then came the night everything went from hell to something darker. Johnny Mitchell Allen was 43, a former real estate agent, a youth pastor, a man with a reputation in certain circles for picking up young girls late at night. On August 6, 2004, Allen spotted Cyntoia walking the street, a child, alone, exhausted. He offered her money. She got into his truck because Kut-Throat told her to, because she was terrified of what he'd do if she didn't, because the streets were not safe, and neither was going home. Allen drove her to his house, not a motel, not a car. His house, a house full of guns, porn, and silence. A house no child should have been in. Cyntoia said from the moment she stepped inside, something was wrong. He stared too long. He moved unpredictably. He showed her guns. He acted like he owned her. He forced her to sleep beside him. He reached under the bed repeatedly, touching something metal. And in Cyntoia's world, men reaching for metal meant only one thing. In that bed, next to a grown man she barely knew, Cyntoia's mind spiraled into survival mode. Her trafficker had taught her, if a man even looks like he's reaching for a weapon, you don't wait. Cyntoia later testified that she believed Allen planned to kill her, that his demeanor changed, that he was reaching under the bed for a gun, that she felt her life slipping away. And so she did the only thing her brain, flooded with trauma responses, could think of. She pulled a handgun from her purse and fired. 1 bullet, 1 second. One terrified child reacting to danger she believed was real. Johnny Allen died instantly. But Cyntoia didn't run in victory. She ran in fear. Fear of Kut-Throat. Fear of police. Fear of what men might do when they learn a teenager fought back. She took money to escape her trafficker. She took his guns to avoid being hunted. She fled the house like she was escaping a burning building. For a moment, she believed she'd survived. She had no idea. Her real nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, police found Cyntoia in a stolen car. She didn't fight. She didn't run. She was exhausted, starving, barely awake. But before she could even speak, the narrative was set. Teen prostitute murders. Man in cold blood. That headline hit the news before an investigator even asked about Kut-Throat, before anyone asked her age, before anyone considered She was a child abuse victim. Police made her look like a heartless killer instead of a trafficked minor. She was 16. 16. Too young to vote. Too young to work a job. Too young to live alone. But old enough, apparently, for the state of Tennessee to treat her like a grown woman capable of premeditated murder. In 2006, Cyntoia Brown stood trial as an adult, not as a trafficking victim, not as a minor, not as a child. The prosecution said she had a cold heart. She executed a sleeping man. She robbed him. She was manipulative. They showed the jury photos of guns, money, alcohol bottles. They didn't show the bruises, the trauma, the child development reports, the years of violence, the brain impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. The trafficker who threatened to kill her if she didn't work. They called her a prostitute. They didn't call her a child. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder. They sentenced her to 51 years in prison, meaning she would not even see parole until age 67. The courtroom gasped. Her mother sobbed, and Cyntoia stared blankly forward, because to her being punished for surviving wasn't surprising. It was normal. Over the next decade, Cyntoia transformed from a frightened girl into a woman who refused to disappear. She earned degrees in prison. She became an advocate. She educated other incarcerated women. She spoke publicly about trauma. She wrote, but every night she slept in a concrete room because adults failed her long before she pulled that trigger. Finally, in 2017, her story hit social media once more. This time, not as a mugshot, but as a question. Why is a trafficked child serving life for killing her rapist? Celebrities amplified her case. Activists protested. Lawyers appealed. And slowly, the world started to understand. What Tennessee refused to see. She wasn't a monster. She was a child soldier in a war against her own survival. As Cyntoia's case gained national attention, the narrative flipped. She was 16. She was trafficked. She was abused. She believed she faced death. Everything the defense had argued years earlier suddenly became common sense. Even Tennessee lawmakers admitted later that the state's approach to children in trafficking situations was outdated and cruel. The world began to ask, how many other children were sitting in prison for surviving dangerous men? In 2019, after 15 years behind bars, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted Cyntoia Brown executive clemency, citing her youth, her trauma, her rehabilitation, her development, her impossible circumstances. She walked out of prison with the world watching. Some people cheered. Some people protested. Some insisted she deserved life. But Cyntoia Brown was free, not because the system corrected itself, but because people forced it to. This case forces us to confront a question. Most people avoid what would you do if you were a trafficked child, trapped in a stranger's house, with a man reaching for a gun. Would you run? Would you freeze? Would you comply? Or would you fight? And if you fought, wouldn't you hope the world believed you? The truth is, Cyntoia didn't survive because she was strong. She survived because she was desperate. She didn't pull the trigger because she wanted to kill someone. She pulled it because she wanted to live. And for 15 years, the world punished her for choosing life. Cyntoia Brown grew up in cycles of violence that never gave her a chance. She didn't escape them. She merely shifted their shape. From the streets, to a stranger's bed, to a prison cell, to a world finally ready to hear her story. Today, she speaks for women still trapped in the shadows she barely clawed her way out of, not as a murderer, not as a monster, but as a survivor. Her story asks us, how many children are we willing to sacrifice before we admit survival is not a crime? This is Behind the Red Line, Episode 26, The Cyntoia Brown Case, the girl they broke before she fought back.